In the last video, we looked at the five strategic elements that we are including in our net zero action plan for HKUST. In this video and in the future videos, we're really going to focus primarily on the strategy number one, require all new buildings to be designed and operated as net zero carbon buildings. If you see in this graph, you can tell that we anticipate a lot of growth to this campus. We want to continue growing, and we're going to add new buildings, research labs, amenities. And as you can see, some of these will be very, very energy intensive, like our data centers. So, how can we deal with all this and also get down to net zero? Well, the strategy here is that we must neutralize all new buildings so that they don't add onto the burden of our existing buildings. As you can see, we already have a very high footprint for the existing buildings, and it will be really challenging to get them down to zero. So we want to make sure that we don't add additional burdens to those efforts as we're growing as a campus. The net zero action plan says that all new buildings must be designed and operated as net zero carbon buildings. And so there's three elements to that. Number one, we need to offset all embodied carbon from the design and construction process. Number two, we need to offset all operational carbon emissions from the operations of the building over time. And number three, in order to pay for this, we need to implement cost recovery measures to ensure that carbon offset costs are fully funded. And this will be through building integrated renewables or through the service fees for building occupants. So let's take a look at these. In terms of the decarbonization for buildings, there's a lot of interesting research now in looking at buildings as carbon sinks. How do we use building materials to absorb carbon and so forth? We'll talk about that in a later video, but for now, there's really two fundamental strategies that we can undertake. Number one, we want to shrink the amount of electricity consumption to as small as possible. And number two, we want to increase the amount of on site renewables to the greatest extent possible. Now, in Hong Kong, we have a real fortunate situation, which is that the government has allowed for a very generous rebate on renewables. We call it the feed in tariff. And the feed in tariff essentially means that for every kilowatt hour that we generate through renewables, we get a certain amount of money back. Now, the advantage here is that the on-site renewables allows us to shrink the amount of electricity that we're purchasing from the grid. Let's call that gray electricity because it has carbon, and replace it with our on-site green electricity. And we get to generate some revenue. And with that revenue, we can buy high quality offsets. So it looks like the building itself with the renewables shrinks the amount of electricity. And then the electricity that we buy from the grid, we calculate how much greenhouse gas emissions are in that component. And then we use the revenue from the offsets to pay it down. Once we get down to zero, then we've achieved net zero for the building. And because the renewables will continue to generate electricity year after year after year, that means that we can pay down the offset costs year after year, meaning that we have now neutralized that building and we can spend more time on the existing buildings on campus. Okay, in the next video, we're going to look at the two components here. One is the embodied carbon, and the other one is the operational carbon. So in the next video, we'll talk about embodied.